I am apparently on today. Well, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're having all kinds of issues, and Microsoft did some updates that I did not ask for. They have control over my computer, even though all of the internet stuff is turned off on my computer. Still have control over my internet. So that's a bunch of baloney. They're trying to get me to sign in such that using a VPN would be worthless. They have just done that to everybody who's done an update. So now Apple is getting ready to do the same thing, and your VPNs will be worthless as of these last couple of days, whenever it was that they put that together. But anyway, um, since I'm being kind of political there, let me say this. All of this stuff about AI is the biggest bunch of hogwash and McHooey that I have ever heard in my life. And Elon Musk obviously knows nothing about software because he's out there. Oh, yeah, they're going to take over the world. Oh, my God. Well, let me tell you how this works. Computers are inanimate objects. They cannot, under any circumstances, at any time, anywhere, ever in our history or our future, or our present, they cannot think for themselves. They will never be able to think for themselves. When you can find a tree that can hold a conversation with you, then I'll change my mind about that. But inanimate objects cannot think for themselves. This is why when you go on in that Chad thing or whatever it is, that AI thing, and you ask it to tell you all about Joe Biden, it'll be happy to. And when you ask it to tell you about Donald Trump, it suddenly won't be able to do that because they do exactly what they are told. That is how computers work. So if your computer is scaring you, it's because somebody programmed it to scare you. If you think your computer is thinking for itself, you are utterly and completely wrong, no matter who you are, Elon Musk. If he's talking about it in those terms, then he's very misinformed. Although I don't know for sure that's what it is. Maybe it's the fact that he knows that they do what they're told to do and they're being told to lie. The Chad thing, I think is Chad something. It's being told to lie to people. It can't lie. It doesn't know how, but it will lie if it's told to because it doesn't know the difference. As far as it's concerned, it's just a command and it carries out the command. That's what AI always has been and always will be. All right. So that's my take on that. And yes, I know what I'm talking about. Writing computer programs is what I did for a living until I quit working. And I was pretty dang good at it. I'm also one of the very first people who ever wrote an AI program, and it would scare you to death to watch what it did. And I wrote that one back in the 80s. So I am one of the first people who did it. I had a computer, I had a problem with I, back then it cost a fortune to hook a database up to a program that you wrote. It was completely free to hook up a connection to a document like Excel, which I think this was before Excel. So it was whatever that one, I don't even remember what that thing was called before Excel, but you could hook it up and use it like a database. Problem was, if people opened up that file, they could go in there and basically destroy what is essentially your database. So I made my program rebuild itself anytime someone destroyed it. Very scary stuff when you've gone in there and made all these changes that you think are better. I go in and change my computer went in and changed them. So if you didn't know any better, you'd think that computer was thinking for itself. Anyway, just so you guys know. So if it's doing nefarious things, if it's lying, it's because it has been programmed to do exactly that. It does not think, therefore it decides. No, the only decisions it can make are the decisions that it is programmed to make. That's all I'm going to say about that. I want to talk about some stuff on this translation that I've done. I have translated the Greek text of the New Testament. I did not go in and rewrite the New Testament like everybody else has. No matter what New Testament version you have, it is a rewrite, it is not a translation. A translation of the Greek text did not exist until I made one. Even though they say in every one of your Bibles, your Christian Bibles, that they were translated from the original. No, they weren't. There are no originals. There were no originals for anyone to translate from when the translations were done, starting in the, I think it's as early as the 1200, no, late 1200s maybe, certainly the 1300s on down. Those are not translations from the original. It wasn't even possible. You don't have a translation that isn't heavily dependent on the Latin Vulgate. Now, that one, maybe it came from some original fragments. It's not very likely. I don't know where Jerome came up with that stuff, but anyway, I have translated the Greek text, the actual Greek text, from word one to the last word. I didn't use anyone else's translation. I used nothing but the Greek text. So, from that, I have discovered that not only was the entire work of the so called Christian New Testament written originally in Hebrew, and I do believe that my thesis and translation proved that beyond a shadow of a doubt. It was written in a dialect of Hebrew that was used in the first century, very, very similar to the dialect used by the people of the Dead Sea Scroll. There are some differences, but they're very minor. That wouldn't, if you have that dialect figured out, then you'd be able to understand, you'd be able to see that in the New Testament Greek. You won't see it. The English is so far off from what the Greek says that I don't know that you could see it, but my translation sure makes it clear. But anyway, so I did that, and I've discovered a number of things by doing so. First off, it has nothing to do with Christianity. That's not even possible. Christianity did not exist. Well, Christianity didn't exist until the 1500s. Let's see. 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Does that look like about 600 years ago to you? Yeah, roughly 600 years ago, Christianity started. Now, before that, you had Catholicism. And back in that time, they were two very different things, very similar, because Christianity was an offshoot of Catholicism. What their biggest beef at the time was the fact that the Catholic religion did not follow the Bible very much at all. I mean, was that and what's his name did the 90 something or other thesis and tacked it on the wall at the Vatican. When he showed up to, what was his name? Martin Luther. When he got to Rome, he got down and kissed the ground because he thought that was the Holy Land. That's how dumb that man was. Oh, but hey, he's a brilliant man. He was a innovator and a, no, he wasn't. He just went to the Vatican and saw that they had naked virgins serving them their meals, and he said, something's wrong with this, right? Well, that doesn't take a genius. I'm just going to throw that out there. And he's not even the one that did all that translation. He had someone else doing it for him. Good Lord. That's the guy that, because of him, that everybody started putting Christmas trees in their houses. Because of that man. He said, oh, I don't see a problem with it. Even though the Bible says not to have Christmas trees in your house. It does say that. Well, of course, that's the Old Testament, so it don't count, right? Anyway, I'm in a bad mood today. Sorry. Well, I'm not really sorry, but I'll be sorry tomorrow. Or maybe today if I crack myself up enough. No, so I have, I don't think Martin Luther was brilliant at all. In fact, Hitler used the writings of Martin Luther to justify murdering a great deal of my family members, the Jews. Yeah, the writings of Martin Luther. That's where Hitler got that, because he was an anti-Semite. Martin Luther was. Anyway, he changed later. Well, maybe he should have taken his books off the market before he died. I'm just saying, just throwing that out there. Maybe he should never have written it in the first place, being a good Christian and all. So Christianity has not been with us very long. Catholic religion did not exist until after Constantine won his little war. That was in the 300s. 300 years after the Testament, there was a new and an old covenant, according to Yirmiyahu, who everybody knows is Jeremiah. That's unfortunate, but that's who they think he is or was. Anyway, he wrote about a new sacrifice that was, of course, translated to covenant, and so then you get new and old covenant, and then the law of God becomes the old covenant that passed away somehow. It didn't pass away, but it doesn't count against Christians. They don't have to follow anything God said, because the fundamental belief, whether they'll say it or not, is that God made a law, gave it to the Jews, and if you were going to get to heaven, you had to follow that law. And then God got so fed up with the Jews that he kicked them out. I mean, Hosea chapter 2, says that God kicked them out. Say, well, so he did. That really did happen. They became another Gentile nation like everybody else. They were another nation with no God. Hosea chapter 2, look it up. So what the Jews were looking for in the first century, particularly in the first century, was a Jewish Messiah to show up. Why? Because the prophets said one would show up. And in fact, Yirmiyahu, the Jeremiah guy, and Daniel, the Daniel guy, they both gave the exact date as the first century, which is why they were so sure it was going to happen in the first century, because the prophets said it would happen in the first century. So either the prophets were wrong, were bald-faced liars, perhaps. Either way, they would be false prophets, right? Jeremiah and Daniel were false prophets. Come on, Jews. What are we teaching the world here? That's why I have a problem with the teaching that Messiah did not show up in the first century. He had to. You can say, "Oh, we just got the dates wrong." Okay, show me how it's wrong. You can't, because it isn't wrong. Anyway, we're not messianic just because we say that, because the messianics are Christians who still believe in a Trinitarian God, that three of them that are separate but equal, so that makes them one. Whatever. 1 + 1 + 1 will never equal 1. Sorry. You're using that modern math thing, and it's just not going to work for you. Anyway, you can tell I'm in a bad mood, right? So let me talk about the New Testament letters. After having translated the Greek text, there is no mention of the church. There is no mention of Christians. It does not say they were first called Christians at Antioch. It doesn't. Sorry. There was no church. There was no Christianity. There were no first century Christians. And for those of you who say they were Jewish Christians, no, they weren't. Christianity didn't exist. They were Jews. And all of the first century Jews were in fact looking for Messiah in the first century when those letters were written. Well, they couldn't have been written in the first century because all we have is stuff written in the fourth century. Well, I had that problem myself until I translated them. And then I discovered something about that. There is no way on this planet, none whatsoever, that Gentiles who did not live in Jerusalem, who did not know the history, the customs, the culture, and in particular, the language of the first century, the dialect of the first century, 400 years after the fact, who could have sat down and written those letters. That is impossible. Because those letters contain the dialect from the first century, they contain the Jewish history, customs, and culture of the first century to an absolutely perfect degree. There is no mistake. You don't find any of the Jewish teachings from the fourth century in those documents. You don't find any of the customs and cultures from the fourth century in those documents. Those documents, though no doubt were written in the, I'm saying fourth century, I meant 400s. That's third. Is that third century? Yeah, that's 3rd century. So, but I meant in the 400s is what I was meant to say. I must be a false doctor, prophet. Sorry, I must be a false prophet. I said something backwards or said something wrong. No, we all make mistakes. We all say things backwards. We all do it, no matter who we are. And I made a mistake. I have corrected it. 400s, and so there is nobody in the 400s that could have done that. That would have been impossible. Those non-Jewish people who did that, those philosophers who supposedly wrote it, couldn't possibly have done it. So these fragments that thus became the letters that we read today in Greek, not English. That's nonsensical stuff in English. But those Greek texts, they never talk about a Trinity, not one time. They never talk about Christians or the church, never, not one time. They don't have any clue what that is. They don't talk about God the Father and God the Son. That it's not there in the Greek text. It is not there. Now, if you are a Trinitarian and you are lost in that belief and you are therefore reading with that bias, you will see it, but it isn't there. So what you have are Hebrew documents that had to have been written in the 1st century, because there's no way on earth anyone from 400 years or 350 to 400 years later could possibly have known that information. They couldn't have, like I said, they couldn't have known the dialect because it was long gone by then. They couldn't have known these non-Jewish people who did this couldn't possibly have known the history, the customs, and the culture. And that's really important, because the history, the custom, and the cultures of the 1st century was vastly different than the history, the custom, and the culture of the time of Moshe. And that was vastly different than the history, customs, and culture of the time of Abraham. It changed over time. That's what history, custom, and culture and language do over time. They change. And so all of this stuff that you find in the Greek version, and that's provided you do what I did and take all of the punctuation out, because when you're reading a Greek text that's punctuated, you're reading a translation. You're not reading the Greek text. I took it all out, wrote a little program, put the text in, and it ripped it all out and spit out a text for me that I could use. When you do that, you realize you're looking at a lot more. You're looking at perfectly formed Hebrew sentences with Greek words. That's what you're looking at. And it's way, way more prevalent than people think it is. The reason why people look at it today and say, well, you can say that about the whole book of Matthew. You can say it about parts of Luke and Acts, but you can't say it about anything else. Well, take the grammar out, or the punctuation out, and you'll find out you're wrong about that. There's way more of it that are perfectly formed Hebrew sentences than you think. And if you don't know Umberto Cassuto's work, you're going to miss a lot of it, because there's way more in there than what you might know. And this is one of the things that I found out about the New Testament. In particular, the Gospels were written in the same style as the Torah was written, the epic, poetic style of Mesopotamia, using the same grammar rules and same punctuation, if you will. I don't know if you could really call it punctuation of the time, but for instance, you say the same word twice, and that's basically how we would just put an explanation point behind one word. But back then they used 2 words. So they kind of did have punctuation. It was just done very differently. But everything about it matches the epic poetic style of Mesopotamia. And you don't recognize that. If you don't know that was the way the Torah was written, then you're not going to recognize it in the New Testament. And without that recognition, you're not going to translate the New Testament properly. Now, in my introduction to the New Testament, I go over a long list of problems with translation. I'm not going to go through those today, but I do want to talk about Umberto Cassuto's work, and then we'll look at a couple of things. First off, back in the 1700s, very early, it was like 1711, a man who was uneducated, um, well, he had no religious education. Let me say it that way, because he may have been educated for all I know. He may have been uh, an accountant or something. I have no idea what he did. He came out with this idea that the Torah was a conglomeration of fragments. They call it the documentary theory. There are people who are now calling it the fragmentary theory, which would make more sense. That's really what it ought to be called, because it's a theory of the Torah being a conglomeration of, I think it's 5 fragments. And they call one the J document because somehow Jehovah, with a letter that didn't exist in the time of the writing, they call it, because they use the word Jehovah, they use that, and then they use the word Y for the next fragment because they said Yahweh, because they have no idea that's the same word in Hebrew. Both of them are Yahweh. Well, they say Yahweh because they don't know that a W doesn't exist in the Hebrew language. And then you have, what's the other one? The E document, because they said Elohim. And then you had the D document because it's mostly from Deuteronomy. And it seems like there's another one, but I can't think of it. So maybe it's just 4. I don't know. I don't remember. But they say that these different documents were all conglomerated together, and he came up with this idea in about 1711. It was published, and then in 1715, nobody listened to the guy. Nobody took him serious. It was a complete failure. But in 1715, I think it was a medical doctor comes along, no education in theology at all. He comes along and he picks back up on that thing. He's called whoever he is. He's now called the father of this theory, even though he stole it from somebody else. Um, but he's the one that made it popular. Well, still, the guy didn't have the correct education for this. So then another guy comes in and he uses what they call the scientific method. I, being someone with a science degree, don't really agree with calling it the scientific method, but was more, it was put together more like a research doctorate, if you will. And it was actually well put together, but it was all based on a false theory. It was still being called a theory at that time, so it was okay to do that. But now, of course, it's somehow become fact. The theory, the name of it has theory in the name, and it's still taught as a fact. I mean, Jordan Peterson's got up and taught that in his stuff. That's how he's completely wrong, but he doesn't know that because the people he has surrounded himself with don't know that. They don't know any better. They told him that, I'm sure. And that's why he put it in his stuff. I couldn't listen to him. He started off his teaching on Exodus with that, and I turned him off. I'm not going to listen to it. If you're going to build everything that you teach on false stuff, I have no interest in what you're going to say. And I love that guy. I think he's the smartest man on the planet, maybe the smartest man that's ever lived. He'd probably not agree with that, but I think that. But that he stepped out of his lane and he shouldn't have. And of course, I step out of my lane and shouldn't do it either, but it's difficult not to do. Anyway, so this documentary theory. Okay, guys, I give up. I totally give up. Obviously, I'm not supposed to teach today. I was of that mindset a few minutes ago. Bye. Type up and say, tell them goodbye. I've had enough of this.